Today we will continue with our third lecture of biology. In our first lecture we discussed the introduction to biology, and we went over some basic concepts relating to biology. For example, the flow of energy, maintaining homeostasis, the characteristics of life, classification of different types of organisms, of different species. In our second lecture, we discussed atomic structure. We discussed the structure of atoms and different types of bonds that atoms form, different interactions between atoms. We discussed ionic bonds, which we said is when two atoms form a bond in which one electron moves from one atom to the other type of atom. We discussed covalent bonds in which two atoms share electrons. We said how in ionic bonds there is polarity, which means one end is positive and the other end is negative, while in covalent bonds, when we have a covalently bonded molecule, sometimes they might be slightly polar, which means one end is slightly more negatively charged and one end is slightly more positively charged. And we also said we had non-polar covalent bonds. The third type of bond we discussed in lecture number 2 was hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is not a chemical bond like ionic and covalent bonding. Rather, it is another sort of interatomic interaction in which a negative end of a polar molecule is attracted to a positive end of another polar molecule. When we have many of these sort of molecules together, the compound has a very strong, there's a very strongly defined structure. And one example of this is with water. When we have many molecules of water together, they are connected with hydrogen bonding, which means that the separate molecules are strongly attracted to each other, and therefore this affects the characteristics of water. For example, cohesion, which basically means that one molecule of water wants to stay with another molecule of water, or the high temperature needed in order for water to vaporize, to evaporate. The reason you need such a high temperature in order for water to evaporate is because of the hydrogen bonds hold the water molecules strongly together. Now, in our third lecture, we are continuing by talking about connections between particles. However, today we're not going to talk about connections between atoms or bonds between atoms in order to create molecules. Rather, we are going to discuss the next level of organization, which are molecules itself. And we are going to discuss different type of compounds which are built of molecules. Now, we're going to begin by discussing organic. Specifically, we are going to discuss organic molecules, which are sometimes called the molecules of life. What are organic molecules built out of? What are the building blocks of organic molecules? Organic molecules are built of oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon. And they are the most abundant elements in living things. What do I mean by that? I mean that other than, for example, in a mammal, the molecule which is most common in a mammal is water. After water, the most common molecules are organic molecules. Now, carbon and hydrogen are the primary constituents of the molecules of life. What are the molecules of life? What are the molecules that are necessary in order for organisms to function? What are the molecules that are necessary in order to build organisms? What are to build cells in organisms and other compounds that are needed in order for biological processes to occur? Specifically, those molecules are complex carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. These might sound familiar to you. Carbohydrates, yeah, we recognize that compound from food. Lipids, that sounds familiar. Protein, that too. And you're right. All those molecules are in food, and that's why we need to eat, because we need these molecules in order for our body to carry out biological processes. At the same time, different forms of these molecules affect our bodies differently. Some of them are beneficial, because we need them. And some of these forms are not beneficial, in fact, are harmful for our bodies. And that's one of the reasons it's important to watch what we eat. Because while we need carbohydrates, we need lipids, we need proteins and nucleic acids for biological processes to occur, for our bodies to function, for metabolism, to build new cells, etc. We want to make sure to bring in molecules that actually will help us and not harm us. So, the 4 types of organic compounds that we are discussing are complex carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So, the actual form of these molecules is going to affect their function. This idea, we're going to see throughout